Hi everyone, my name is Mingjiao. Today I will reflect on my literacy journey as a Chinese EO learner and a future secondary teacher in history and visual art. I will discuss my understanding of literacy has changed from seeing it mainly as language acquisition to understanding it as a social and a discipline-specific practice. I will also link my personal experience to the curriculum. In this seminar, I will begin by briefly outlining my early literacy experience in China and how this shaped my initial understanding of literacy, and then discuss my transition to studying in Australia as a Yale learner and how this experience challenged and expanded my understanding of literacy as a social and cultural practice. Finally, I will explain what I will understand about literacy teaching in Year 8 history, link my learning to the Australia curriculum and AITSL Standard 2.5 before concluding with a professional reflection. My first stage of literacy development happened before I could read and write in China. At that time, I was developing oracy. I learned literacy by listening and speaking, listening to stories from my parents, following instructions, and learning how to express my needs. This early experience became my initial cultural capital because it shapes how I understand language before school. As I grew older, I started learning Chinese characters, and this was a very visual experience. Unlike English, like phonetic language, Chinese is a logographic system, means that characters come from pictographic and symbols rather than sounds. Each character carries meanings through its shapes, structures, and visual elements. Through this process, I began to understand that images are also texts that need to be read, not just words. This became the fundamental or function of my semiotic awareness, learning how symbols, visuals, and signs communicate meanings. In primary school, literacy learning became more structured and exam-focused. Much of emphasis was words, knowledge, and grammar, such as copy characters and memorize vocabularies. At this stage, I was mainly operating a code breaker. My second stage of literacy development occurred during high school in China, where learning became increasingly exam-focused and centered on reading and writing. However, this stage marked an important shift in how I understand text. A key turning point was to study classical Chinese, which introduced me to a new academic discourse. Through this experience, I moved from mainly become a code breaker to become a text analyst, as described in a 4 resources model. Rather than simply decoding words, I learned to analyze how authors construct meaning, expressed emotion, and positioned ideas within specific historical and cultural contexts. Studying classical texts and philosophers also developed my dialectical thinking, allowing me to consider multiple perspectives instead of searching for a single correct interpretation. When analyzing texts such as Journey to the West, the popular one that's in the worldwide, I become aware that texts are not neutral, and that ideology and power can be embedded in language. The process helped me to develop historical empathy as well, enabling me to engage with the values and worldviews of people from the past. Reflecting on this stage now, I say it as a point where my literacy moved beyond literacy comprehension toward critical literacy, preparing me for my later learning in Australia. The third stage of literacy development began when I studied abroad in Australia. This was a turning point because I realized it's not just about understanding language, but about participating in a social practice. Even when I understand the words, I sometimes struggle to participate confidently in seminars and academic discussions. This helped me to recognize that literacy involves learning new discourses, ways of speaking, thinking, and interacting that are shaped by culture and context, as described by Jean Paul Jane. Through study and interacting with people from diverse backgrounds, I come to understand literacy as social situated, where meaning is negotiated through interaction rather than simply decoded from text. And this understanding deepened during my diploma design, where I realized that literacy is also multimode. This aligns with my concept of New London Group, where I recognize that meaning is made through multiple modes, not just writing language. Reflecting on this stage, I say this point where my understanding of literacy shifts from language acquisition to literacy as a social and cultural practice, shape how I approach literacy teaching in Australia. At this stage, my understanding of literacy has shifted significantly. Literacy is no longer just a set of skills that I learned at school, such as reading and writing. Instead, I now understand literacy as a way of being, how individuals make meaning, participate, and communicate in different contexts. Through reflecting on my own journey and engaging within Australian curriculum, I now understood that literacy is one of 7 general capabilities and it must be taught in every subject. According to ACARA, literacy includes text knowledge, grammar knowledge, word knowledge, and visual knowledge. Involved students learning to comprehend it and compose a range of texts, including multimodal and multimedia texts. As a future art and history teacher, I now understand that literacy learning must be intentionally planned with subject areas. As Henderson emphasized in 2019, subject-specific literacy does not develop automatically and cannot be assumed. So in both history and visual arts, literacy is discipline-specific, shaped by how knowledge is created, communicated, and evaluated in each subject. My goal as a teacher is to support a student to move from being code breaker to become text analyst, who can think critically and communicate meaning effectively in both learning and everyday life. To support this in practice, I will use the literacy learning progression as a planning and differentiation tool. It helped me to name the literacy demands inside the text and teach explicitly. It can be a reference to know where a student is at and what the next step look like. Those evidence help me to design the rubrics and write more specific according to the indicators. When students are working at different levels, the progression also supports me to adjust tests appropriately differently, ensuring all students can access and progress in their literacy learning. Linked to the curriculum, Year 7 to 12 history, where literacy is embedded through analyzing history resources, using evidence, and communicating explanations and arguments. Through these years, literacy demands progress from describing historical information to analyze perspective and evaluate evidence, reflecting literacy as a development process. As a future history teacher, this understanding informs me how I plan lessons to support students in developing historical thinking and community meaning effectively. Use Year 8 history as example. Literacy is similar to how students develop historical understanding. According to curriculum, students are expected to analyze primary and secondary resources and use evidence to extract historical explanation as outlined in these 2 descriptions in Year 8. When I unpack these expectations, I can say that the involved specific literacy demands. Students need to understand key historical vocabulary such as source, evidence, and perspective To support this, I will basically teach them those terms using vocabulary lists and short revision activities and encourage students to apply them in discussion and writing. Students also need to understand how historical resources work. I would support this by comparing primary and secondary resources and discussing why and they were created and how they are used differently. Another key literacy skill is reading resources critically. In teaching, I would model how to identify origin, purpose, and perspective, and use guided resource exercise questions to help students to practice this independently. Finally, students are required to communicate their understanding through writing. To support this, I would use writing frames and sentence starters so students can clearly link evidence to explanation. My professional journey as an EL learner gave me a unique advantage as a future teacher. I'm able to emphasize with the challenges students face when navigating new academic discourses, and I can draw on my bilingualism as the resources to support diverse learners in inclusive ways. Overall, I now understand literacy as a lifelong journey of making meaning. As Andrea Hepper once said, nothing is possible, the word itself says impossible. Thank you. And here is a reference list. Thank you.